Greetings and welcome back to BADM 468. We are now on week 3, and I will be summarizing chapters 5 through 7 for you today. Keep in mind that you will see me looking down as I am actually looking through my textbook. So grab your textbooks. We're coming out of, again, chapters 5, 6, and 7 of your course text, Crafting and Executing Strategy, and we will get right into it. So, chapter 5 starts out talking about the 5 generic competitive strategies, which is really, I feel, an interesting topic when you think about organizational strategy. And again, thinking from the standpoint of wanting to, as an organization, be able to dominate in the market. So, our learning objectives for today, we should leave this chapter with an understanding of how to distinguish each of the 5 generic strategies and why some of these work better in certain kinds of competitive conditions than others, and the major avenues for achieving a competitive advantage based on lower costs. In addition, we should understand the major avenues to a competitive advantage based on a differentiating company, product, or service from the offerings of our rivals, which are our competitors, and then also the attributes of a best cost provider strategy, which is a hybrid between the low cost and differentiation strategies. So let's start out as we have with the other chapters with a quote. And I think we will go with the first one, Michael Porter. We've heard from him before, but he's a professor and co-founder of Monitor Consulting. And he quotes that a strategy delineates a territory in which a company seeks to be unique. So I think that's a really great quote to start us off. And the text goes on to share the authors let us know that we're starting out here just so you can join me again on page 116 and 117 of chapter 5, that a company can employ any of several basic approaches to competing successfully and gaining a competitive advantage over rivals, but they all involve delivering more value to the customer than their rival and also delivering value more efficiently than their rivals, or both. So the company is looking to deliver more value and deliver it more efficiently. So those are the differentiators. And this more value for the customer translates as a good product in the sense of a lower price, also a superior product that is worth paying more for, or a best value offering that is an attractive combination of both. So one of the things that we can use as an example of that might be Starbucks versus Dunkin' Donuts. Now, of course, Starbucks has a higher price point, but Starbucks also has ambiance. When you walk into a Starbucks, they typically have sort of that whole sort of what's what I'm looking for, a dark, relaxing feel. Not dark so much so that you can't see, but it's very relaxing, very rustic. And then also it smells like coffee. There's always some type of jazz playing, and they have the New York Times and the Washington Post. So it's just more of an upscale environment. Whereas you go to Dunkin' Donuts, I consider that to be more of a working man's coffee shop, if you will, not in a bad way, but you're just trying to get your coffee on the run, where Starbucks is more of an experience. So you would expect to pay a higher price point. So just coming down on that chapter, I'm just going to hit some highlights really quickly because, again, we're summarizing 3 sections or 3 chapters. So I'm going to go pretty quickly. But again, you're encouraged and required to read these chapters in full and to do your weekly discussion board, your tests, and your assignments, as well as your self-assessment. So I'm just starting you out, okay? So the first major section is types of generic competitive strategies. And the authors let us know that a company's competitive strategy deals exclusively with the specifics of management's game plan for competing successfully and its specific efforts to position itself in the marketplace, please customers, and ward off efforts of competitive threat, and to achieve a particular kind of competitive advantage. So they give, just this understanding that comes following that is, what are these 5 competitive strategies? And then they give a definition. So we can go to figure 5.1 on the next page to sort of see a graphic of what that looks like. But I'm going to, for the purpose of video, just give you the broad definition of each. So one is a low-cost provider strategy. And that's where you try to achieve lower cost overall than your rivals on comparable products that attract a broad spectrum of buyers. That's just a portion of that definition. Number 2 is a broad differentiation strategy, and that was where you seek to differentiate company products that are offering from rival products as well, by offering superior attributes that will appeal to a broad spectrum of buyers. So you have the same products as another company, as your rival company, but you're trying to differentiate yourself in a way that is broadly applicable. 3 is a focused low cost strategy. And that's where you might focus on a very narrow buyer segment. And that is one where there's outcompeting, you're trying to outcompete your rivals in terms of cost and thus being able to serve niche members at a lower price. So, as you read this, maybe give me some feedback, maybe in your discussion boards on, what might be an example for you of a company that has a tight niche market where this might be applicable as a strategy. And then 4 is a focused differentiation strategy. And that is where you concentrate on the organization will concentrate on a narrow buyer segment or niche, and they will outcompete rivals by offering their niche members customized attributes that meet their tastes and requirements better than the rivals' products. So again, give me your thoughts and ideas as you do your discussion board this week on what might that product look like, or what is the company that comes to mind that has a focused differentiation strategy. So lastly, number 5, a best cost provider strategy. That is where they give the customers more value for their money by satisfying the buyer's expectations on key quality, features, performance, service attributes, while also beating their price expectations. So this is a strategy, a hybrid strategy of some of the elements of the other ones we mentioned, specifically the low cost provider and differentiation strategy. So this is a really great strategy, I feel, overall for markets to consider, for organizations that are competing in these markets to consider. So those are the main points of the first section of chapter 5. And then what goes on from there is the chapter just breaks out the sections of each of those. The remainder of the chapter is breaking out each of these 5 competitive strategies, 5 generic competitive strategies. And of course, you'll see some illustrations that relate to that. So I'm just going to leave you there with chapter 5 because, again, it's just goes more specific and in-depth. So that's just more starting you out. Now, if we'll turn over to chapter 6, which is on page 144 and 145. And chapter 6 talks about strengthening a company's competitive position. So strengthening a company's competitive position. So once you get that space in the market, you want to strengthen it so that you're not able to be moved, so that you're rooted, you have a firm foundation in the market. And you have to do that by making strategic moves as an organization. It involves timing, proper timing, and the scope of your operations has to be considered. So with that, there are some learning objectives that we want to understand and leave with, and that was whether and when to pursue offensive or defensive strategies to improve our market position as a company. Next, we want to leave with an understanding of when being the first mover or fast follower or late mover is most advantageous, and we'll define those. And then also we want to understand the strategic benefits and risks of expanding a company's horizontal scope through mergers and acquisitions. Lastly, we want to think about the advantages and understand the disadvantages of extending the company's scope of operations via vertical integration, and then the conditions that favor farming out certain value out chain activities to outside parties. So when is it a good time to outsource? And then finally, when and how strategic alliances can be substitutes for horizontal mergers and acquisitions, vertical integration, and outsourcing. So as usual, let's start out with a quote, remembering that you are encouraged and required to, again, read this chapter and do the assignments, the corresponding assignments and discussion boards. But we're going to start out with a quote by Dan Millman, who is an author and a lecturer. He says, think of your priorities, not in terms of what activities you do, but when you do them. Timing is everything. And so that is very true. We have to be able to move with the accurate and proper timing of the market and time in such a way organizationally that we're successful. And that may mean that we move ahead of our rivals, that we stay and mark time, or that we wait until things have settled out and come in at a strategic time. So there's an advantage to timing. So the authors introduced the chapter to us by sharing that once a company has settled on which of the 5 generic competitive strategies that we just reviewed in chapter 5, once they've decided on which one to employ, then attention turns to what other strategic actions it can take to complement that competitive approach and maximize the power of overall strategy. So that's what we're talking about here. So they go on to give us an example, a definition called a strategic offense. And so when you think about strategic offense, the whole offensive, or an offensive is like when you think about a war or a battle, is about moving ahead. In football, I don't watch football, but I understand defense and offense. Your defense, you're trying to defend a position. Offense, you're trying to take ground. So here we're talking about how a company can strategically take ground and gain positions in the market, as we define or use this definition they give us. So it says no matter what or which of the five generic competitive strategies a firm employs, there are times when a company should go on the offensive to improve its market position and performance, and strategic offensives are called for when a company spots an opportunity to gain profitable market share at its rival's expense, or when it has no choice but to try to whittle away at a strong rival's competitive advantage. So they give companies examples of companies like Samsung, Amazon, Facebook, and Google, and states that they play hardball, that they're aggressive, and they pursue competitive advantage and try to reap benefits by leading market share, excellent profit margins, and rapid growth. So it says some of the best offenses tend to incorporate several principles, and those principles that they share four, are to focus relentlessly on building competitive advantage, and then striving to convert it into a sustainable advantage. So once you've gained that competitive advantage, you've taken that mountain, you have to sustain that position. You have to be able to stay in that position. And then two, applying resources where rivals are least able to defend themselves. And then three, employing the element of surprise as opposed to doing what rivals expect and are prepared for. So definitely want to catch our competitors off guard so that they don't have time to launch their own offensive, and they're scrambling to try to figure out what to do next. So you want to definitely have the element of surprise when you're talking about a strategic offense. And again, these concepts that we're talking about, or that I'm teaching you, or that we're summarizing today, that the authors give us, have wide applicability both in our personal life and professional life. And then four, displaying a capacity for swift and decisive action to overwhelm rivals. So I love that. So we should be quick in our decisions, and we should be decisive. So that's important. Again, that's a life lesson. We should not have to wait and take forever to come up with making decisions. So thinking about that. So then they go on to talk about how you choose the basis for your competitive attack, which is really interesting. And so I'm going to hit on just one specifically, a special kind of offensive, because this will be one of the homework questions, or one of your assignment questions. I think it's maybe a test question, but it's called the Blue Ocean Strategy, which is really a cool name. And so the Blue Ocean Strategy the authors share is one that seeks to gain a dramatic and durable competitive advantage by abandoning efforts to beat out competitors in existing markets, and instead inventing a new market segment that renders existing competitors irrelevant. I love it. And allows a company to create and capture altogether new demand. How exciting is that? So there is no competition. So basically moved out into new waters. And so this is a really keen concept. And so one that, I want you to read. And so they give the example of companies that have done that. So some of the examples they give on page 149 that have created blue ocean market spaces includes NetJets, which is a fractional jet ownership, Dry Bar and hair blowouts, Tune Hotels, Backpacker Hotels, Cirque du Soleil, and things like that. And so this is Zipcar, so just really unique, innovative ways to gain new market share where others, your competitors and rivals, are not even doing it, nor have they considered. So this is really a great concept to consider. And then, of course, on page 150, they give us an illustration of a company named Gilt Group that has adopted and utilized the Blue Ocean Strategy. So I encourage you to read over that. And then, of course, going over to 151, one of the ideas that they left us with in the previous portion of the chapter is that timing is everything. So we read our quote on timing, and how timing a company's offensive and defensive strategic moves is key. And so they talked about the three types of advantages of timing, and they named those for us. And the first one that they talk about is first mover. So when you're the first mover, they said that these are people that are market pioneers. And this type of first mover typically bears greater risk and greater development costs than the firms that move later, because, of course, they're forging new ground. I'm on page 151 if you want to follow along. And then also it says if the market responds well to the initial move, then the pioneer will benefit from having a monopoly position. So they don't have any competition at this point by virtue of being first to market. That enables it to recover its investment costs and make an attractive profit. So there are some benefits to being the first mover. So the next one, of course, there's some disadvantages also that you'll read over and learn about. But that's one that you want to think about. And then the company has to decide whether or not it wants to be a first mover. So again, that's something to consider. Going on, the authors go on to tell us about the different strategies as it relates to vertical integration and horizontal integration, etc. And so I'm just going to define that for you really quickly. And it says that a vertically integrated company or firm is one that performs value chain activities along more than one stage of an industry value chain system. So you learn what that means. You'll learn some of the advantages of that and the disadvantages of that, and what considerations need to be made. But also one of the things that the authors introduced was the concept of outsourcing. So when you outsource as a company, that means that you use outside suppliers, vendors, etc., to move your value chain along, because that allows you to have more efficiency and be more fast moving. And also that those are companies that specialize in doing those types of activities, so that you as a manager, as a strategic leader, can focus on the things that matter. So when you think about outsourcing, it involves contracting out certain value chain activities that are normally performed in-house to outside vendors. And this has great applicability as it relates to how you can strategically have this make sense. So they share on page 162, they being the authors, that outsourcing certain value chain activities makes strategic sense whenever the following exists. And that is, an activity can be performed better or more cheaply by an outside specialist. The activity is not crucial to the firm's ability to achieve sustainable competitive advantage. The outsourcing improves organizational flexibility and speeds time to market. So I want to repeat that. The outsourcing improves organizational flexibility and speeds time to market, and it will reduce the company's risk exposure to changing technology and buyer preferences. So there are benefits to outsourcing your operations, but of course that also comes with risk, and these should be considered. So going on, the rest of the chapter just focuses on strategic alliances, which are really important when you think about, again, strengthening your company's competitive advantage. And so the authors define strategic alliances as a formal agreement between two or more separate companies in which they agree to work cooperatively toward some common objective. And they give the example of Daimler Chrysler and Shell Oil Company and Pemex, Deer Park Refinery and another company, Renault and Nissan. So there are times where it makes sense for companies to come together so they gain a great standing in the market, but they're also able to reach different buyers within those markets and have just a huge market share position that they gain, and also not only be sustainable, able to dominate the market. So that is chapter 6, and we are going on to chapter 7. And in chapter 7, what we're talking about are strategies for competing in international markets. So this is really exciting, talking about going global. And so we are starting there. Chapter 7 starts in your textbook on page 174 and 175. And what we want to take away from chapter 7 is, or are the following objectives. So the first is to understand the primary reasons or why companies choose to compete internationally. How and why differing market conditions across countries may influence a company's strategy and their choices when thinking about going into international markets. The 5 major strategic options for entering a foreign market. The 3 main strategic approaches for competing internationally. How companies are able to use international operations to improve overall competitiveness. And lastly, we want to understand the unique characteristics of competing in developing country markets. So let's start out with a quote. And I think we'll look at Jack Welch, and I think we've heard from him before in a previous chapter, who is the former chairman and CEO of GE. But he states that globalization has changed us into a company that searches the world, not just to sell or to source, but to find intellectual capital. the world's best talents and great ideas. So there's wide merit, great merit for a company considering international market expansion, because not only will they gain a greater market share, but also they gain greater talent, the potential for great talent and the potential for great new ideas that had not been previously considered. So that's important. So the authors open up the chapter by sharing with us that any company that aspires to industry leadership in the 21st century must think in terms of global, not domestic market leadership. And that is because the world economy is globalizing at a very fast pace. We can see that if we watch the news. I'm a huge CNN junkie. And that it's happening at an accelerated pace, and it's as ambitious. Growth minded companies race to build stronger positions in the market more and more, that foreign markets are doing the same, and that information technology is shrinking the marketplace. That means that with this technology that we now have with the iPhones and with um, cameras and with the technology that's building, we have so much and more access now to markets that we currently and previously had not. So it's really like shortening the distance between us and other parts of the world, which has huge competitive advantages. So one of the things they share as we go into this is why companies decide to enter foreign markets. And one of the reasons is that it gives them access to new customers, which, I mean, that's a no brainer, right? And then the second is it also allows sometimes companies to achieve a lower cost through economies of scale, experience, and increased purchasing power, because a dollar may not be as much in those countries, and also labor may not be as expensive in those countries. So the U.S. company can build its products cheaper in terms of labor and possibly supplies. Number three, the reason that a company might consider going global is to gain access to low cost inputs of production, as I just shared. Also, to further exploit its core competencies. And an example of that, it says a company may be able to extend a market leading position in its domestic market into a position of regional or global market leadership by leveraging its core competencies further. So an example they give is that Walmart is capitalizing on this expertise in discount retailing by expanding into the UK, Latin America, Japan, and China. And Walmart executives are doing this in belief that the company has tremendous growth opportunities in China. And companies can often leverage their resources internationally also by replicating a successful business model using their blueprint operations, the same as what they've done in the US. So an example of that would be Starbucks and McDonald's. So I remember when I went to Germany, the Starbucks in Germany looked exactly like the Starbucks in the US, and they had the exact products that the one in the US had. So they didn't make any changes, they just positioned themselves as the same company, if you will, the same building, same coffee, etc., but in a different market. And then lastly, number five, to gain the purpose of, again, going internationally is to gain access to resources and capabilities that are located in foreign markets. So those are the reasons why a company should or may consider that piece. Now, going on to page 177, one of the things that the authors share is that when companies think about making a strategic move internationally, that it does come with some level of complexity. And so, because when you have a home country advantage, that's one thing. But when you go into another country, you have other things that you need to consider, both advantages and disadvantages. So, if you'll turn to page 178, then you can see a figure 7.1, which is referred to as the diamond of national competitive advantage. And so, when you're in your home country, of course, you have the home country, home court advantage. And it gives different considerations for that, to include demand conditions, firm strategy, structure and rivalry, factor conditions, and related and supporting industry. So the authors do a comparison and a contrast of when you have a home court advantage, home-based advantage when you're in your home country versus when you go into another market or a foreign market. Turning over to page 184, there are five major conditions or major strategic options for entering foreign markets, and those need to be considered when going internationally. And the first is to maintain a home country production base and export goods to foreign markets. So that means that you would keep your company in the US and you would just send your products across the water. to license foreign firms to produce and distribute the company's products abroad. So there's some consideration and some advantage to licensing a foreign company to send your products for it, because I've heard that it can be extremely costly to do to send products and services and things like that abroad. But if you have a foreign mediary, then they've already worked through all the red tape, all the legal issues, all the legalese, all the tariffs and trades and things that happen that way. So that may be one consideration that would lessen the burden of trying to get products into a foreign market from the U.S. Also, you can employ a franchising strategy where you just basically, again, take, for instance, a Dunkin' Donuts, a Burger King, and you offer franchise opportunities to individuals in those countries. So that's one consideration. Also, and establishing a subsidiary of your organization is another consideration for how you might enter an international market. And lastly, relying on strategic alliances. So that's where those joint ventures and things of that nature come to pass. So making friends across borders, if you will. So then turning over to page 189, the authors introduce us to the three main approaches to an international strategy. And they are exemplified in figure 7.2 on page 190. And they are the global strategy, which is where you think global and you act global. The transnational strategy, which is where you think global but you act local. And the multi-domestic strategy, which is think local and act local. And so the authors break those down for you. I'll let you read those on your own. And then they go on to give us the advantages and disadvantages of those three particular types of strategies. And then, of course, an illustration. So we will wrap there. This is a great chapter. These three chapters together should give you a really great understanding or how to proceed if you ever decide that you want to go into some type of organization, or if you go into a huge organization or even a small one and you have this understanding, then as a leader, you can help those companies to understand how they can begin to position themselves and what types of strategies they should choose in terms of cost, but also to begin to go into international markets. So we will wrap up the chapters here. Again, this is Dr. Patrice Carter, your instructor for BADM 468. And from here, you should go and complete your homework assignments, your discussion boards and tests and self-assessments under your weekly content folder. Take care and email me with any questions to carterp@campbell.edu. Take care.